The autumn wind howled through the pines as Thomas McKenna guided his rickety wagon down the muddy main street of Redemption Falls. At 35, Thomas was a man carved from hard wood, standing 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to carry the world's weight. His steel-grey eyes held the loneliness of a man who had spent years felling trees in solitude, and his massive, scarred hands told stories of countless encounters with saw blades and axe handles. The town square buzzed with unusual energy as Thomas approached. A crowd had gathered around the courthouse steps, their voices rising and falling like an uneasy tide. Thomas had planned to sell his timber quickly and retreat to his cabin, but something in the air made him pause. The way women turned their faces away and men shuffled their feet spoke of shame and secrets. Silas Crow, the town's self-appointed auctioneer, stood on the courthouse steps with his weaselly frame and pencil mustache. His voice carried over the crowd with practiced authority as he sold off belongings of those who could no longer pay their debts. "Next item, ladies and gentlemen," Crow called out with false cheerfulness, "is a particular piece of property that I'm sure will interest our more discerning citizens." Thomas pushed through the crowd until he could see clearly. What he saw would haunt him forever. Chained to a post like a common animal stood a young woman, her head bowed but her spine straight with unbreakable dignity. She couldn't have been more than 22, with auburn hair that caught the afternoon light like burnished copper and skin pale as fresh snow. Her once fine dress hung loosely on her slender frame, speaking of recent hardships. But her emerald eyes, when she briefly lifted her head, blazed with intelligence and fierce pride that circumstances could not crush. "This here is Miss Catherine O'Brien," Crow announced, with the tone he might use for livestock, "lately of Boston, Massachusetts, well-educated and suitable for household duties. Miss O'Brien finds herself unable to pay debts incurred by her late husband's gambling habits. The law being what it is, she must be sold to satisfy said debts." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. He had heard of such corruption in lawless territories, but to witness a human being reduced to chattel filled him with pure, consuming rage. Catherine raised her head again, and her gaze met Thomas's across the crowd. For a moment that stretched into eternity, two souls recognized something kindred in each other's eyes. She was drowning, and her emerald eyes called out for salvation. The bidding began at $50. The bidders were exactly what Thomas expected. Jim Rawlings, who owned the local brothel and had a reputation for cruelty, Marcus DeVille, a cattle baron who collected beautiful things, and surprisingly, Reverend Blackwood, whose pious exterior hid whispered about appetites. As bids climbed higher, Thomas watched Catherine's face grow paler, her composure cracking. When Rawlings bid $200 with a crude comment about putting her to work, Thomas saw a tear escape her eye, though she quickly wiped it away. Something broke inside Thomas McKenna at that moment. Perhaps it was the memory of his sister Mary, who had died young and alone while he was away earning money. Perhaps it was simply recognizing one of those moments when a man must choose between safety and righteousness, regardless of cost. $300, Thomas heard himself say, his voice carrying clearly despite his shock at speaking. $300 was more money than he'd seen at one time in his life, more than his cabin, tools, and wagon combined. Catherine's eyes found his again, and this time there was hope alongside desperation. Thomas was committed now to a course that would either save them both or destroy him completely. $300 from the lumberjack, Crow called out with surprise. "Do I hear $350? $350, Rawlings snarled, glaring at Thomas with undisguised hostility. "And I suggest the timber boy finds somewhere else to spend his money." The threat hung in the air, but Thomas was past caring about consequences. $400, he said simply, his voice steady despite his hammering heart. He was bidding with money he didn't have, committing to debt that would take years to repay. The bidding continued with Rawlings and DeVille, driving the price higher, each bid accompanied by increasingly detailed descriptions of their plans. Thomas matched them dollar for dollar, calculating how many years of labor his commitment would require. When the bidding reached $600, DeVille dropped out. Rawlings glared at Thomas, debating whether to continue the financial battle or eliminate competition through more direct means. $650, Rawlings said, his voice tight with fury. $700, Thomas replied without hesitation, the words coming from deep determination he hadn't known he possessed. Rawlings started to raise his hand, then stopped, his cruel intelligence calculating odds. "The lumber boy can have her," he said loud enough for all to hear, "but he better watch his back. 700 going once, going twice, sold." Crow's gavel struck wood like an executioner's axe. Thomas had just enslaved himself for years, all for a woman whose name he barely knew. But as he pushed through the crowd, seeing the mixture of relief and wariness in Catherine's emerald eyes, he knew he'd make the same choice again. "You'll need to sign papers," Crow said as Thomas approached, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. $700 is considerable. The contract specifies that if payment isn't made within 30 days, the sale is void and reverts to the next highest bidder. His eyes flicked toward Rawlings. Thomas signed with steady hands, though inside he felt like he'd signed his death warrant. As Crow unlocked Catherine's chains, Thomas saw her wince at the raw red marks on her delicate wrists. "Ma'am," Thomas said, removing his hat respectfully, "I'm Thomas McKenna. I'd like to offer you the protection of my home until we can figure out a more permanent solution." Catherine studied his face, trying to read his intentions. Whatever she saw satisfied her. "Mr. McKenna, I find myself in your debt, though I confess I'm uncertain what that means for either of us." Her voice was cultured music after the auction's harsh cacophony, speaking of privileged upbringing, now lost to circumstances. "It means you're under my protection now. I give you my word that no harm will come to you while you're in my care." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "A gentleman lumberjack. You're not quite what I expected when I found myself being sold like livestock." As they walked to his wagon, Thomas felt the crowd's eyes upon them, sensing curiosity, disapproval, and barely concealed hostility. By interfering in the auction, he had marked himself as a troublemaker. The ride to Thomas's cabin took 2 hours through winding forest trails. The silence between them was heavy with unasked questions and unspoken fears. As sunset painted the sky in shades that reminded Thomas of Catherine's hair, he finally spoke. "I suppose you're wondering what kind of man spends his life savings on a complete stranger. I'm wondering why you did it, what you expect in return, and whether I've traded one captivity for another." Thomas was quiet for so long, Catherine thought he wouldn't answer. "I had a sister once. Mary was her name. About your age, when she died alone in a mining camp hospital while I was in logging camps trying to make money to bring her west. She died believing I'd abandoned her. I swore I'd never again stand by and watch someone suffer when I had power to help regardless of cost. When I saw you, saw the fear in your eyes and how you held your head high despite everything, I saw Mary. I saw every person who needed help but didn't get it because decent people were too concerned with their own comfort." Catherine absorbed his words and the pain behind them. "And what do you expect from me, Mr. McKenna? What does $700 buy?" Thomas halted the wagon and faced her fully. "Nothing. It buys you time, Miss O'Brien. Time to figure out what you want to do with your life. Time to heal. Time to decide your own future. The debt is mine to worry about. You're a guest in my home, not a servant." Catherine searched his face for deception or hidden agenda. She saw honesty so naked and raw it took her breath away. "You're either the most noble man I've ever met or the biggest fool in the territory." Thomas's weathered face creased into a genuine smile. "Ma'am, I've been called many things, and I suspect you might be right on both counts." They reached his cabin as darkness fell. It was larger than expected, built from hand-hewn logs with a stone chimney, speaking of warm winter nights. A covered porch overlooked a small clearing with a carefully tended vegetable garden. After the mansion she'd grown up in, this wasn't much, but there was something about it that spoke of peace and security. "It's not much," Thomas said apologetically, "but it's warm and dry." Catherine breathed in pine sap and wood smoke, feeling something inside her relax for the first time in months. "Mr. McKenna, after where I've been, this looks like paradise." Over following days, they settled into a routine that surprised them with its natural ease. Thomas would rise before dawn for forest work, leaving Catherine with books from his surprisingly extensive library. In evenings, they sat by the fire sharing stories with the openness that comes when kindred spirits recognize each other. Catherine learned Thomas was far more educated than his exterior suggested. Raised by a schoolteacher mother who filled his head with poetry and philosophy before consumption took her, he could quote Shakespeare and Wordsworth from memory. His cabin was filled with books on everything from natural history to classical literature. He had chosen solitary lumberjack life, not from lack of options, but because he found peace in honest labor's rhythm and deep woods' silence. Thomas discovered Catherine's story was classic tragedy and betrayal. Born into Boston privilege, she was a successful merchant's daughter who received the finest education money could buy. She married young to a charming man who seemed to love her, but hid a gambling addiction that consumed their fortune. When her husband died in a duel over gambling debts, Catherine found herself alone and penniless, with creditors who sold her into indentured servitude to recover their money. "And then," she said one evening watching fire burn to embers, "a guardian angel appeared in the form of a lumberjack with more money than sense and a heart bigger than Montana territory." "I'm no angel, Catherine," Thomas said, using her first name for the first time. "I'm just a man who couldn't stand by and watch injustice when he had power to stop it." As weeks passed and autumn gave way to winter's first snows, both realized what had started as charity had grown into something deeper. Easy companionship had transformed into something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed. They were falling in love, slowly and carefully, like two people hurt too many times to trust their hearts easily. The crisis came on a bitter December morning when Thomas returned to find 3 men in his cabin. Catherine sat by the fire, pale but composed, while Jim Rawlings and 2 associates made themselves comfortable. Rawlings looked up as Thomas entered, cruel face splitting into a fang-revealing grin. "Well, well, if it isn't the noble lumberjack. Your woman offered us coffee while we waited." Thomas's hand moved to his axe, but he forced calm. These men were dangerous. "Mr. Rawlings, to what do I owe this visit? You know why we're here, McKenna. It's been over a month since that auction, and word is you're having trouble raising the money. $700 is a lot of timber for a man working alone." Thomas felt stomach-clenching fear he'd carried since the courthouse square. He had worked 18-hour days until his hands bled, but harsh reality was he could never earn $700 in 30 days. He had perhaps $200 worth of timber ready, but early winter made transport nearly impossible. "The contract gives me 30 days, and I'm good for the money. Your word doesn't spend like coin." "You defaulted, which means the lady reverts to me as second highest bidder." Catherine spoke for the first time, voice steady despite visible fear. "The contract specifies 30 days from sale date. By my count, that's not until tomorrow." Rawlings's grin widened, eyes remaining ice cold. "That's where you're wrong, sweetheart. I talked with Crow about exact wording, and there's ambiguity about calendar versus business days. Crow thinks Sundays don't count, meaning your time was up yesterday." It was transparent legal chicanery, but in Redemption Falls, law was whatever men with money and guns said it was, but Catherine wasn't ready to surrender. Rising with queenly dignity, she fixed Rawlings with a steel-melting stare. "Mr. Rawlings, you're forgetting something important about this situation." "And what might that be, darling?" "The fact that I am not actually property to be bought and sold. I am a human being with rights under the Constitution, and no kangaroo court can change that." Temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as Rawlings's false friendliness evaporated. "Listen here, you high and mighty Boston bitch. Out here, the only law that matters is the law of men with guns. You belong to me now." Thomas stepped between Catherine and the three men, hand openly on his axe. "No, she doesn't belong to you, and she doesn't belong to me. She belongs to herself." "You planning to fight all three of us, lumberjack?" "If that's what it takes," Thomas replied, and Catherine's heart swelled with love and terror. This man was willing to die for her freedom. "Wait," she said, stepping from behind Thomas. "There might be another way." She reached into her dress bodice and withdrew a small object that glinted in firelight. It was a ring, simple gold set with a single diamond that caught light like a captured star. "This ring was my grandmother's, and her grandmother's before her. It's been in my family for over a century, worth at least $1,000. I'm willing to trade it for my freedom, $1,000 worth of jewelry against $700 of debt." Rawlings stared with naked greed, torn between desire for valuable jewelry and stronger desire to possess Catherine herself. "That's assuming the ring is real. Then perhaps you'd like it appraised by someone qualified. I'm sure Mr. Goldstein at the assay office would examine it." The mention of the honest assayer tipped the balance. "All right, I'll take the ring in payment. But I want it examined first." Catherine nodded, though her heart was breaking. The ring was her last family connection, but freedom was worth more than gold. "Then we have an agreement," she said, extending the ring. But Thomas's large hand closed gently over hers. "No, I won't let you sacrifice something precious for my mistakes." "Thomas," she said softly, using his first name deliberately, "it's not your mistake, it's my choice, and I choose freedom, with you, over any jewelry." The words hung heavy with meaning beyond the immediate crisis. For the first time, Catherine had openly acknowledged the bond between them, the love neither had dared speak aloud. "Well, isn't this touching?" Rawlings sneered. "Hand over the ring, lady." But as Catherine started extending the ring again, the cabin door burst open. Sheriff Marcus Webb stood in the doorway, badge glinting, hand on his Colt .45. Behind him stood 3 deputies, weapons visible. "Nobody move," Webb commanded, with 20 years law enforcement authority. "Mr. Rawlings, you and your boys step away real slow." Rawlings flushed red with confusion. "What the hell is this, Webb? This is private business." "That's where you're wrong, Jim. I got a very interesting telegram from the federal marshal's office in Denver. Questions have been raised about that auction's legality." Catherine's heart skipped, hardly daring to hope. Webb pulled folded paper from his coat. "This is a federal court order declaring that auction null and void on grounds of fraud and corruption. Mrs. O'Brien's late husband's debts weren't as legal as certain parties claimed." Blood drained from Rawlings' face. "That's impossible. Crow had all the paperwork." "Silas Crow is enjoying federal lockup hospitality in Denver. He's been manufacturing phony debts and selling innocent people into slavery. The whole operation's shut down." A deputy stepped forward with iron shackles. "James Rawlings, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, human trafficking, and charges that'll keep you busy for 20 years. As deputies arrested Rawlings and his men, Webb turned to Catherine with gentleness. "Ma'am, I apologize for what you've endured. That auction was pure crime, and you should never have been subjected to such treatment." "Does this mean I'm free?" Catherine whispered. "Free as a bird, ma'am. The federal court declares you a fraud victim, not a debtor. All charges are dropped." Thomas felt a mountain lifted from his shoulders, crushing weight of debt and responsibility suddenly gone. But more than that, he felt overwhelming joy. Catherine was truly free, which meant anything between them would be her choice, not gratitude or legal obligation. As Webb led prisoners away, the cabin fell silent except for crackling fire and Catherine's quiet sobs. Thomas stood awkwardly, wanting to comfort her, but unsure if he had the right now that circumstances had changed. "Catherine, are you all right?" She turned to face him, green eyes bright with tears, but shining with something that made his heart race. "Thomas, I need to tell you something." He braced himself for whatever she might say. Perhaps she would thank him and leave, returning to Boston privilege. "I love you," she said simply, words falling like stones into still water. "I know this situation has been strange, and you might think my feelings are gratitude, but they're not. I love you, Thomas McKenna, not because you saved me, but because of who you are. Because you're kind and gentle and brave and good, because you read poetry when you think no one's listening, because you talk to animals like old friends, because you were willing to sacrifice everything for a stranger's freedom." Thomas felt his heart stop, restart, then beat so hard she must hear it. "Catherine, I've loved you since I saw you on those courthouse steps. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid you might feel obligated because of circumstances." She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell lavender in her hair and see gold flecks in her green eyes. "There's no obligation anymore, Thomas. I'm free to choose, and I choose you, if you'll have me, if you'll." Instead of words, Thomas cupped her face gently and kissed her, with all the tenderness and passion building in his heart for weeks. It was a kiss speaking of love finally acknowledged, of two souls finding their perfect match, of a future bright with possibilities neither had dared imagine. When they broke apart, Catherine smiled with joy radiating from every feature. "So what happens now?" Thomas grinned, weathered face transformed by happiness. "Well, I was thinking we might make this arrangement more permanent. If you wouldn't mind being married to a lumberjack who talks to trees and reads Shakespeare by firelight." "Mr. McKenna," Catherine replied, voice dancing with laughter and love, "I can think of nothing I'd like more. A dud and two broken souls, brought together by cruel circumstances, found healing and wholeness in each other's arms. The debt that threatened to destroy them became instead the foundation of love that would last all their days." They were married the following spring, in a ceremony with half of Redemption Falls attending. The ring Catherine had been willing to sacrifice became her wedding ring, its simple beauty perfect for her new life. As years passed, their love only grew stronger. They raised 3 children in that cabin, teaching them values of honesty, compassion, and courage that brought their parents together. Thomas never became wealthy in money, but was rich beyond measure in things that truly mattered. Their story became legend in Redemption Falls, told around countless firesides as an example of how love can triumph over darkest circumstances. It became a tale of hope for those facing dark times, proof that sometimes salvation comes from unexpected quarters, and true love is worth any sacrifice. If you enjoyed this tale of love and redemption from the Old West, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more stories celebrating the triumph of human spirit over adversity. In the comments below, tell us about a time when someone showed you unexpected kindness, or when you had the chance to be someone else's unexpected hero. Your stories matter and inspire us to keep sharing these tales of courage, love, and hope from America's frontier past.